Ronnie, what's the situation? How many do we have so far?
I think 51.
51.
Okay, I think we'll start and people will join as we start. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Ohad Lavi. I'm the CEO of Neurotech Solutions. We are very happy to have you with us today. And I'm very excited to open the first international symposium of Neurotech Solutions. It has been in the planning for quite some time, and we're very fortunate to have a great panel of speakers with us today that will share some of their experience and knowledge. I would also like to take this opportunity early on to recognize Ronnie Buchman, our marketing director, for the wonderful work she has done in putting this event together. Thank you, Ronnie. The topic of the symposium is frequently overlooked challenges in the evaluation and management of ADHD, inattentive presentation in adolescent girls, differential diagnosis, and comorbidity. Why did we choose this to be the first topic for the International Symposium? Well, 3 years ago, we engaged in an experiment in 2 English schools. 550 children altogether had Moxo test and an ADHD teacher rating scale. There were many, many interesting insights from this activity, such as that the ratio between boys and girls with attentional difficulties, as described in the Moxo test, was almost 1-to-1, whereas in the teacher rating scale, it was close to 3-to-1 in favor of boys, which highlights the value of a objective test. But the most interesting finding, in my opinion, was that in 22% of the cases, Moxo detected attentional difficulties where the teachers did not, and that 80% of these were girls with abnormal results in their attentiveness or timeliness index. These are the transparent girls, and my 17-year-old daughter was one of them. So there is definitely a problem here, and I hope this symposium will help shed some light on this important aspect. In general, the way we see the company moving ahead and the way we describe our mission when we wake up in the morning and go to our offices is this way. We hope to help eliminate undiagnosed ADHD. That is our mission. And helping every person with ADHD improve their quality of life and fulfill their potential is our passion. This is why we wake up in the morning. This is why we go to the office. That is why we keep on improving our products as much as possible. As to the schedule of today's symposium, after my short and brief presentation, each of the speakers will have around 20 minutes to present their speech. Dr. Goldstein, unfortunately, due to his personal reasons, has to leave a bit early. So we've allowed some extra time for questions specifically for his session. You will not be able to speak during the event. I'm sorry for that, but there's just too many participants at the moment. That's a good thing, but a bit too crowded if we allow you all to speak. And the chat is also going to be closed. But please submit your questions during the symposium through the Q&A box. And don't forget to address them to the right speaker. We will not be able to answer all of your questions, but questions that will not be addressed at the symposium, we will answer them personally to you by email. We will finish the symposium with a sneak peek into our new and improved Moxo reports, to include automatic treatment assessment report by our product director, Aviram, who is here with us today. And besides that, we have some new and exciting programs that I would like to shortly introduce. The Moxo Agora is the first one. This is the place to think Moxo. This is a new community for Moxo users to engage with one another, design new research, comment and suggest new features on Moxo. The Moxo campus is a place to learn Moxo. This is an online campus that we are now designing for continuous learning of the Moxo and its use. Here you will find published research, case studies from members of the Agora. tutorials, and an annual accreditation for using the system that we will be applying soon. And finally, Moxo Ambassador. This is the place to share Moxo, which is a program for clinicians that have good experience with Moxo and would like to invite their colleagues to enjoy the use of the tool for some financial benefits for them both. Get in touch with us through email if this is something that can be of interest to you. We're also very happy to share with you that a new and improved site for Moxo is now live and active. In it, you will find new case studies, news, demo clips, as you can see here, many more surprises, and we would be happy to get some feedback from you. We also created a new patient brochure, which will help you promote the Moxo to your patients, explain to them about the test, and help them get prepared for the test itself. So that's it from me for now. We'll later talk about the new reports in separate presentations. So without further ado, I would like to kickstart the symposium by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Sam Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein has authored over 50 trade and science texts, as well as over 36 science-based book chapters and 30 peer-reviewed research articles. He has also co-authored 10 psychological tests and currently serves as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Attentional Disorders and sits on the editorial board of 6 peer-reviewed journals. And for those of you who are still not impressed, he recently previewed a new play that he wrote. He plays an instrument and he composes his own music. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Goldstein as our first speaker today.
Thank you, Ohad. Let me bring my screen up.
Yep, you can do that now.
And let's see. Can everybody see my? There we go. And let me just minimize everybody's pictures. Okay, and it's a pleasure to be here. One of the things Ohad didn't mention is that I serve as the research coordinator for Moxo, which is a compensated position. But for this presentation, I believe myself and my colleagues are not compensated, nor do we have any ongoing financial relationship with Moxo or with Neurotech. We're here because we believe that moving forward, this type of assessment and the knowledge that comes from this kind of work is critical for children and for all of our future. And Ohad made an interesting comment about identifying children who go below the radar. And I'll ask you to consider, we won't talk about it today, maybe another day, does one require a diagnosis to have a problem? That the children who are identified by the Moxo performance clearly have a problem, and yet the thresholds for the teacher's observations don't behaviorally identify that. So it creates an interesting conundrum about trying to help children be the best they can be, function the best they can function, even if in fact they don't have a diagnosis. And that's what's exciting about what we're doing at Neurotech and what we're doing with programs like Moxo in helping all children harness effective and efficient strategies to solve problems and to attend to task. Let me pull up my slide. I have 20 minutes. We'll go quickly through this. I want to talk a little bit about ADHD and this new idea of executive functioning, which is really a new phenomenon. It's a term that was coined by the Russian neuropsychologist A.R. Luria about 70 years ago. There are more theories about what it is and what it isn't than probably any other area in psychological science. And I'm going to make a case for what I think it is and why I think it's important for us to distinguish. Just quickly to set a foundation, ADHD as a diagnosis involves 2 criteria: inattention and hyperactivity, impulsivity. I say 2 because in factor analytic studies, hyperactivity and impulsivity are predictive of each other. So ADHD is a 2-factor disorder with 3 sets of symptoms, and that's what you see there in that slide. And if we had more time, we could spend more time discussing why hyperactivity and impulsivity are so intertwined with each other and why they are in fact very different than the inattentive symptoms in this diagnosis. So what is attention? Again, it's a debatable issue. When I was an animal researcher, before I decided I liked children better than rats, for me and my animals, attention was what the animal was focused upon. When I began working with children, I discovered that often lack of attention as described by a parent and a teacher was really describing lack of compliance. When a rat's not paying attention, it's sleeping. Many of these children, when they were not paying attention, were in fact not complying with the adult's request, but they were paying attention to something. It's a complex process involving multiple parts of the brain, leading to functional deficits and then impairment in all walks of life. And both the DSM, the American version of this ICD, as it were, and the ICD both require cross-situational impairment. It's not enough to have symptoms. Before 1987, one could diagnose ADHD absent impairment, but now you cannot. You have to have impairment and problems. So I think inattention is a condition that reflects inefficient operation of the physical brain, moderated by the mind. Where is the mind? What is the mind? Why do we have a mind? These are all questions for another day, but it's for sure that no other organ in our body has developed a mind, and the mind serves to give us an idea of where we are and what we're doing. It allows us to travel through time in our heads. It allows us to think, which has an upside and to some extent at times a downside. And so ADHD is a biopsychosocial problem. The outcome is impairment in functioning. Now, what is executive functioning? You get all kinds of descriptions. Is it a set of behaviors, working memory, planning, problem solving? Again, I only have 10 minutes. I can't define them all. I assume you each have your own idea of what they are. But is it a set of behaviors, or is it one function, how you do what you do, comprised of all kinds of behaviors? One EF theorist believes there are 42 executive functions, and every few months he finds a new one. Others believe there is one or two or three that are then subsumed by a number of these other behaviors. What parts of the brain do you need? Well, it would appear that efficient EF involves the entire brain. What do you have to do to strategize effectively, to function effectively? You have to plan, make decisions, troubleshoot, correct errors. You have to bring EF online when it's dangerous or technically difficult, when you have to overcome a habitual response, when it's late at night and you want a snack. Do you have the Haagen-Dazs ice cream, or do you have an apple? To make that decision for your health requires that you bring EF online. When you look at EF this way, how you do what you do, you can understand why some researchers have suggested that EF, executive functioning, really is the equivalent of ADHD, that deficits in executive functioning are exactly the same as deficits in ADHD. And while I will argue that is true, I will show you data just quickly that in fact it extends beyond ADHD. So you need many parts of the brain for this. Given my time, I won't stop, but clearly the orbitofrontal lobe plays a role. Damage to the orbitofrontal lobe of the brain often leads to patterns of impulsivity, hyperactivity, inattention, and often aggression, sort of an injury-related kind of ADHD. And about half the patients we see at my clinic, where we see 400 or 500 children and a few hundred adults every year with brain injuries, more than half are taking a stimulant because they demonstrate behaviors related to ADHD. And again, EF theories suggest a regulator, something that controls a set of processes or a set of behaviors. I will tell you these slides are posted on my website, which is just samgoldstein.com, so you can download these slides if you'd like to have them. So how did we address executive functioning, myself and Jack Naglieri? We looked at a census match sample, a US census match sample of children, matching for sex, age, race, ethnicity, parent education, so that we have a representative sample. And we did a factor analysis, an exploratory factor analysis of behaviors that are thought to reflect executive functioning. We created an eigenvalue or a scree plot. This tells us how many factors offers the best solution for the behaviors we're measuring. For example, if I say a child is restless in the classroom, restless in the car, restless at the dinner table, I'm evaluating 3 behaviors, but it's one phenomenon, how restless the child is. And that's what exploratory factor analysis tells you. And exploratory factor analysis, we did it in this particular study, we did it 2 ways. And we looked at the eigenvalues, and you can see here, I hope you can see my arrow, this drop from 1 factor to 2 and a flattening out. A scree is a pile of rocks at the bottom of a cliff. We call this a scree plot. And you can see that 1 factor, the numbers are there, that 1 factor best explains all of those behaviors in executive functioning. That's not to mean that every child is exactly the same. Some children may have better planning and weaker initiation. Others may have better emotional regulation, but weaker planning. But on a group basis, this is exactly the same. And we did the same thing with another set of data and again, find 1 factor. So the bottom line is using a large sample, an epidemiologic sample matched to the population, executive function is the way to describe this, not executive functions. It's how you do what you do. And any behavior that improves performance impacts EF. I don't have time to go through this data. This is an intelligence test. This is my neuropsychological measure, the cognitive assessment system. This is academic achievement. These are corrected correlations, and you'll see that anywhere between 15 and 25% of how the child performs on these tests is based on how they take the test, what they do. Here's
Sam, I think we're still stuck on slide number 8. Was that your intention?
No.
Okay.
You're not up to 16?
No, we're still seeing number 8.
I don't have any idea.
Maybe stop sharing and reshare, and that may fix itself.
Sharing. I apologize. I thought everybody could see these slides. Let's see. What do you see now? What do you see now?
Now
We're not
it's dark.
seeing anything.
Black.
I apologize. To not take any more time.
No, let me share your presentation from my computer.
Okay.
Okay. And just quickly, which slide do you want to
Well,
show?
I don't want to go back given my limited time. So I was up to slide number 16.
This one.
Yeah. So if people can see that, yeah, now it's too small. Go back and just show them your full page. Yeah, there we go. And I apologize. So what this one shows is that strategy improves performance between 15 and 25% on an IQ test, on an achievement test, on a neuropsychological test. The fact of the matter is that how you do what you do is a significant contributor to outcome. And that's what executive functioning is all about. Move to the next one. Is it just ADHD? So I'm going to go very quickly. The blue is ADHD. The red are normal children. And you can see parent, teacher, and self-reports for behaviors related to executive functioning, the significant weaknesses in kids with ADHD. But it doesn't just stop there. Go to the next slide. Look at kids with autism, the same gap between normal in the red and kids in the blue with executive functioning problems. Go to the next one with autism. Here's learning disability. Go to the next one. Here's mood disorders. So any stressor, cognitive, emotional, experiential, that causes disruption in functioning leads to deficits in executive functioning based on parent, teacher, and those are adolescent self-reports on our executive functioning instrument. Go to the next one. I'm almost done. There's gender differences. If we had more time, I think one of our other speakers is going to talk about girls, but in our study, girls are smarter than boys. Girls have better EF at every age than boys by about 1/3 to 1/2 a standard deviation. Go to the next slide. And that's teacher ratings as well, which is why teachers like girls better than boys. Go to the next one. So there you have it. What is the relationship between EF and ADHD? ADHD is a diagnosis. Executive functioning is a process based on a set of processes. ADHD is defined by behavior. EF is defined by these processes, how you do these things. ADHD is a summary term for a group of symptoms. EF is a summary term for a group of processes. ADHD may include some EF processes like planning. EF may include some ADHD symptoms like paying attention. Tests for ADHD and EF do not correlate very well with behavioral measures of these conditions, meaning Moxo test, as you heard today, may identify children that teachers don't identify. The correlation between behavioral tests and observational measures are not exactly identical. ADHD is defined by a research consensus. EF at this moment has no such consensus. ADHD is clearly not executive function deficit disorder. And you can go to the next slide. And again, there's my website, and you can download this set of slides. I apologize for the confusion in the program. I appreciate Ohad's quick thinking, and I've exhausted my time plus a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. Actually, not that quick. You went to slide 16 by the time I figured out that we were not on the same page with you, but okay. Thank you very much for that. Any questions to Sam? Maybe from the panel as well.
Yeah, I just take the opportunity to congratulate everybody and thank Dr. Goldstein. I have a question. Those differences that you show are on reports by the parents, is that right? Like between depression and ADHD or ASD and ADHD, what will happen if we use an objective measure?
We don't know that.
We don't, okay.
That's okay. What we're trying. That's the next step in the research. So you raise a good point. Are self-report measures objective? And we suggest they're subjective, but before we publish them, that's the Comprehensive Executive Function Inventory, the CEFI, one of my tests. We have demonstrated it is valid, it is reliable, it measures differences over time. So it's not just a laundry list. I would argue that it is the observer's report, and to the extent it is subjective, but we build what we call validity measures into these tests now. So the CEFI has a validity measure where I can determine whether the parent is accurately reporting, is over-reporting, or is under-reporting. And those data are excluded from the study. But you're absolutely right. The next step is to have those children complete a Moxo and see what they look like. And at our center, I now have probably 1,000 Moxos across a broad range of children with neurological and developmental problems. And at some point, we'll analyze that data.
I mean, the other possibility is that we're measuring different things. One is, I mean, it's objective and subjective. Subjective because it's what the parents or the teachers see, but they're measuring the function in the real life. And then when you're measuring executive function in the lab, it's another set of skills and you know, right, and variables. So that's why sometimes they don't match.
Well, that's right. And it would be surprising if they did match.
Exactly.
Just to the participants, when you look at the browser below, you have a button there that is saying Q&A. When you press that, you can actually ask questions there. I know it's not the usual way to do it for you. You usually use the chat, but it's disabled in this symposium. So just for consideration in the future. Any more questions from the panel, from the audience? Okay, thank you very much, Sam. And our next speaker is Professor César Sotuyo. Professor Cesar Sotoyo is a professor of psychiatry and the director of the ADHD outpatient program at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. Cesar is a member of Untitled Guidelines Group and the Scientific Program Committee of the World Federation of ADHD. In addition, Cesar is a reviewer of 29 international journals and is the author of 74 original reports, 95 book chapters, 241 abstracts at national or international conferences, and has authored or edited 19 books. We have been fortunate to have been working together since his days at Navarra Hospital in Spain before he moved to the United States. And I'm honored to welcome Professor Sotoyo as our next speaker. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. We can't hear you, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Ohad. It's a real pleasure to finally have this first international symposium. Let me just share my slides, please. Yeah, I've been working with Mr. Lavie for a long time as a member of the International Advisory Board, and I thank your company for having me in the board. So my task will be to talk today about developmental difficulties in ADHD differential diagnosis. I'm going to focus a little bit on what Dr. Goldstein mentioned on the difference on when you have anxiety, depression, and then you throw on top of everything the current pandemic. So let me see. All right. So these are my disclosures. As I said, in this meeting, and as Dr. Goldstein mentioned, we're not compensated, but I'm a member of the International Advisory Board with Neurotech Solutions, and I do a lot of advisory for different companies in different countries. And I want to thank everybody on the panel as well, on top of Ronnie Rockman as well. This is where I work. So this is the Texas Medical Center. And I'm part of UT Health, the University of Texas, and that is just part of the medical center. This is our hospital. This is one of the clinics here, the UT Physicians Clinic, University of Texas. And this building here is the Department of Psychiatry. This building here is the main building of the University of Texas. And then these are all other hospitals, Children's Hospital, several hospitals and universities. We see a lot of kids from different sources, from different referral sources. And my agenda will be to talk about the developmental challenges on how ADHD changes, and the face that you see, it might be different, and that's they might be very difficult to diagnose and differentiate. But not just differential diagnosis, but sometimes you have comorbidities. So it's not you have one or the other, sometimes you have both. And then how to assess symptoms, a little bit on how do I do it and what do I do in clinically, and also evidence-based as far as how to know where to start when you're starting treatment. So, ADHD changes through the lifespan, and you have impulsivity that is going down from preschool to early adults, although it doesn't go down all the way. Hyperactivity goes down in adolescence, and then inattention tends to go up. So depending on the moment where you see the patient, you're going to see a different set of symptoms. And it might be very, very different. And as it was mentioned before, if you see girls, they're probably going to be more inattentive, and then they might be transparent, and as Mr. Lavie mentioned before. And in adults, the picture would be a little bit different. And then you have increasing frequency in the comorbidity and added complications. You have the different patterns of presentations between boys and girls, although although still like the combined subtype is or the combined presentation is the most frequent in females, but you still have the inattentive presentation that is quite frequent, almost a third of the girls. All right. So you need to make a differential diagnosis, and that needs to be done from the developmental perspective. So, you know, sometimes I write a diagnosis as ADHD versus high activity for his age, but not necessarily hyperactivity. And then developmental or situational anxiety, because anxiety is very frequent in young kids, which is when ADHD is starting. And then from the psychosocial point of view, a history of abuse or neglect or deprivation, understimulation, and on the other hand, overstimulation or lack of structure. And we have seen this in the COVID pandemic with a lot of parents leaving the whole free day for the kids that are using all the day playing on their screens, on their computers or phones, and then going to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning. They're having problems, you know, telling me in the clinic that this kid is not doing well in school. Of course, if you go to bed at 2 o'clock, you're not going to do your online schooling. And then there's a medical set of differential diagnosis that is, I think it's frequently overlooked. So, and I'm fortunate to work in a clinic that is called Integrated Behavioral Health. So I work directly with the pediatrician. So I have the pediatrician right there, and we're in the same floor with the pediatricians. And I can tell them to have a look at this kid if some of these issues haven't been addressed. Most of the times they've been addressed before, and I know what are the medicines that they take and what are the, you know, if they have epilepsy, if they have any diabetes or any genetic problems, etc. These are some of the syndromes that I see on a day-to-day basis. So I see very, very severe cases of genetic syndromes, and that they have, on top of that, behavioral or attentional or executive function problems, right? And then you have to do a psychiatric differential diagnosis that is going to be with disruptive behavior disorders, which frequently come together with ADHD, mood or anxiety disorders, including bipolar spectrum that have been under-recognized, but also psychosis, substance use that is frequently also overlooked in adolescents. And then, although it's not very frequent, but sometimes you get the sense that the parents want a diagnosis because they're looking for something other than the clinical care, and that you have to be aware. But that's not very frequent in my experience, right? So then what happens if it's not differential diagnosis, but it's comorbidity? Well, ADHD is frequently comorbid with anxiety and mood disorders. These are the results from the National Comorbidity Survey here in the US. Substance use is very frequent, and then impulse control. If you look at the sample from the MTA, of course, in the MTA, they excluded a lot of patients that had a strong comorbidity. So that's why you have a low frequency of mood disorders. But look here, you still have a lot of anxiety and a lot of oppositional defiant disorder. And only 30% of these children in the MTA, 7 to 10 years old, that were highly selected, and they rule out a lot of problems. Only 30% had ADHD, you know, pure ADHD with no comorbidity. So these are all the other problems that you can have on top of ADHD: the disruptive and impulse control, the mood disorders, anxiety. Also, don't forget the sleep disorders, obstructive sleep apnea. It's also more frequent in kids that have obesity or are overweight, and some other problems. And then the learning problems, reading, math, and written expression problems, right? Of course, also the comorbidity is different depending on the sex. It's more frequent to have a mood disorder if you are a boy. Boys are in blue, girls are in orange. And then Anxiety is more frequent in girls, and of course, the oppositional defiant disorder is much more frequent in boys, up to 60% of the kids with ADHD. All right, and the important part of the comorbidity is that it's also a predictor of chronicity. These are the predictors of chronicity, and that's a question that I get every day in the clinic in the first visit. Is this going to go away? Doctor, is he going to be on medicine, or is he going to have ADHD for the rest of his life? And if you have a patient that has a lot of aggression, a lot of conduct problems, high or elevated hyperactivity and impulsivity, family history, comorbidity, or psychosocial adversity, you're more likely to have a chronicity. And in our area, we've been suffering in addition to COVID, but we have been suffering from floods, from hurricanes, and also from high unemployment rates or neighborhood violence. So you have to you have to take all that into consideration when you're talking with the family. So, you have to decide whether these symptoms of concentration problems, psychomotor agitation, or low motivation, low energy, and also mood lability are due to ADHD or depression. You have very similar symptoms with anxiety, low concentration. The mind is wandering because of worries, psychomotor agitation, a lot of fear, and mood dysregulation if you force them to face their fear. In the pandemic, you have the real danger. So I was telling my kids in the clinic that, nothing's going to happen. Don't worry if they're fear or if they have a phobia of storms or phobia of germs. And then you get the pandemic, so they come back and they tell me, you see, I told you, doctor, I told you that we're going to get something really bad's going to happen. And I just had to shut up myself and say, okay, you're right. I mean, you're totally right. But on top of that, you get the disruption of the routines and the support system that they have. So then you have to decide whether it's one or the other, or if it's the comorbidity. Okay. So speaking of how COVID-19 may have impacted the school-age children, and I'm seeing this now as the children are coming back to school, you see that when they went into lockdown, they have no structure, no routines. Those kids with ADHD who had academic support or extra, one-on-one teachers lost that completely. They have to have their parents supporting them, and sometimes their parents were stressed out. And then, you have a death in the family, or maybe one of the parents is sick from the illness. They lose their job, and they have more social isolation, so they don't see their grandparents anymore. The extended family. Reduce social and sport structure, that is very good, like exercising and sport team activities are very good for kids in the school. Problems with sleep, as I mentioned, because they don't have a schedule anymore, so they stay up all night. Initially, they thought it was a long vacation. And then also the reduced expectations. So sometimes the kid is not having a lot of problems from the academic point of view, but you don't know whether that's because they reduce the expectation and they're just, passing everybody, or because they're getting better. So you kind of in a struggle. You don't have a point of reference as you had before when they were going to school, having their academic support and so on. We did with the Untitled European Network for ADHD Guidelines Group, we did these guidelines for initially in the pandemic, and we've updated those for the treatment using telemedicine, because using telemedicine is also a struggle. You don't see the patient in the office, you see the patient through the screen, and sometimes they might be very fidgety, so you don't see that. And you started to lose some of the information. And I see now that when they're coming back to the clinic in a few seconds, you can assess how they're doing just by looking at them. All right. From the point of view of depression, you have to. I wanted to remind everybody that suicide is the second cause of death, starting at age 10 till age 34, and the first cause of suicide is depression. We're part of the Texas Child Mental Health Care Consortium, which all these hospitals, and we're studying depression in youth and suicidal behaviors. From the point of view of anxiety, anxiety in different studies is very prevalent. This is a study in Norway only with anxiety symptoms, not the diagnosis, and 33% of the patients, or these were preschoolers, had anxiety symptoms. Of those who had ADHD, a third had anxiety symptoms. And then you also have to remember that the anxiety or different anxiety disorders have a different age of onset. So you start with simple phobia, separation, and then maybe social phobia, generalized anxiety, and so on. And they come one after another in their development. So there might be different layers of anxiety symptoms. All right. Okay. So basically, when you're, and I'm finishing, almost finished now, but when you're are looking at a patient that has ADHD, you have to decide whether you have to know from the history what happened in their development. So whether they had ADHD, and then because they couldn't do the work and they don't want to go to school because they fail a lot, then they start having anxiety or depression because they fail and everybody tells them that they're a failure, or they get bullied by other kids. Sometimes you have anxiety first. This kid is very anxious. He doesn't want to go away from the parents, and then, or depressed. They are very sad. They have depressive symptoms and problems with concentration. And then they develop ADHD symptoms. So you don't know if it's true ADHD or if it's what I call secondary ADHD. Not true ADHD is they're not having ADHD because they're very worried in the school all the time and they cannot pay attention. Or they're very sad and they have low energy and they don't pay attention. And then the other possibility is that you have both things going on at the same time. So at any point, you're going to have to make a decision. What are you going to address first? And it depends on if you're looking at this possibility up, first ADHD and then secondary anxiety, or the ADHD secondary, or if they go at the same time. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So when you're assessing the symptoms, one thing that I do is I have a lot of rating scales to assess comorbidity. So this is a picture of the scare, the anxiety rating scale. And here you see that in blue that this patient had generalized anxiety, social anxiety, and school avoidance behavior. So you have those symptoms that maybe in an interview you're not going to get if you're in a busy clinic. All right, and then, they're worried about COVID and they're worried about meeting new people and they're very, very restricted. So that's on top of that. You have to assess, as Dr. Goldstein was saying, the intellectual function. This is a case of a girl who was thought to be not very bright, and she had a low verbal IQ and kind of normal low total IQ. And she hadn't been treated. Then when you talk to her, she had clear symptoms of ADHD on top of this difficulty. So we treated her, and after the treatment, not doing anything else, her performance in the test and the IQ test improved. Of course, it improved because she wasn't paying attention, in part because she had ADHD. Okay, so that was not true. That was not a true verbal IQ problem. That was related to the inattention that she had. Okay, and then the other things that you can do, and this is an example with Moxo. We have this patient that had this problem with timing and impulsivity or impulsiveness. And here you see the picture of the performance in the test, in punctuality or timing and in impulsivity. And then we treated this patient with medication, and then the picture improved. We only have, most of the symptoms were resolved other than timing, but child clinically was still having a lot of problems. So then you have to look, you know, if they're better on the test and you have this improvement, then maybe if they're having problems, maybe you're missing something. So we start looking and we found that she also had a significant anxiety on top of the ADHD. So then you're able to address that. All right. So to finalize, you have to look at when you have these two diagnoses going at the same time, and I write here anxiety, but it's the same for depression. If you have to look what is the most severe one. If the most severe is ADHD, or if it's anxiety, or then you have to treat the most severe, the one that is causing more impairment first, and then both could improve. Or if one doesn't improve, then you have to go to the secondary or residual symptoms of the other. And if you have, if one worsens, for example, if you treat ADHD and anxiety worsens, you may need to choose another set of medication or treat the other diagnosis first. If you have the two diagnoses that are strong and equally severe, then what do you do? Well, you have to look at whether, for example, if you're using stimulants that could worsen anxiety, maybe you need to consider not stimulants, or you may want to use both treatments for anxiety and ADHD at the same time. And when I say treatment, I'm not just saying medication, I'm saying also behavioral treatment and cognitive behavioral therapy. All right. So to conclude, I like to say that ADHD has many different phases, depending on the age and development and sex and the comorbidity, and then environmental stresses and demands. So you both need a good baseline evaluation. Then you need to have a theory if you have two disorders at the same time of what's going on and what are you going to treat first. And then you have to be ready to change your plan if that doesn't work. You have to be very, very flexible, because sometimes you think something and then that's not true, or that doesn't go the way you think, and then you have to change to the other direction. All right. With that, I want to thank my team here at the University of Texas, with my social workers, research assistants, and therapists, nurses, and also my colleague, Dr. Babatope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sotuyo. It was a fascinating talk, and I already have one question that I wrote down for myself, but I see that there's other questions, but we will save them to the end of the session. So you can stop sharing your presentation.
How do I do that? Okay, so let me just try to do that.
Top of the screen.
Top of the screen, stop sharing.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. Thank you.
No problem. So up to our next speaker, Professor Topkular Barish. He is the chair of the Department of Neurology at the Demiruglo, I'm probably mispronouncing it, Bilin University, and is an associate professor of neurology in the Department of Neurology at the Florence Nightingale Hospital Neurology Clinic in Turkey. His experience includes research, clinical practice, and teaching, and has over 50 published research or clinical manuscripts and presentations. He has expertise in behavioral neurology, Alzheimer's disease, neurology, and neuroscience. We are lucky to have been working with Barish for a few years now and are currently engaged in a very interesting research around dementia and the use of the Moxo as a tool for early diagnosis of the condition. I'm honored to welcome Professor Topkular as our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Adhd, for the kind presentation. I think Professor Berger is sharing his screen at the moment. Is that right? I'm seeing Professor Berger's screen right now.
Yes.
Okay, now a second.
Okay. Itai joined us. Hi.
Okay. No. So let's.
So now you can share it.
So, okay, no. I hope you're now seeing my screen.
Yes, we can.
Great. Let me screen. Okay. So in the next video, I'll just hold this down so it will be much better. Okay, so in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I will be mostly discussing how we use Moxo in our neuropsychology lab and in clinical practice. So I'll be mostly focusing on adult patients, either with ADHD or different cognitive disorders. So let's move on. I somehow can, yeah, that's okay. Perfect. So as we have already talked about cognitive tests, there's a huge number of tests that we use in clinical practice, either for neurology or psychiatry or psychology, different tests for verbal fluency, abstract functioning, speed of information processing, and attention or working memory. So the basic idea is that each test actually represents a different cognitive function of the brain. Like executive functions represent Wisconsin. So let's say Wisconsin card sorting test represents actually the executive functions, re-auditory and verbal learning test represents verbal memory, and each cognitive function actually represents a different cognitive network in the brain. So the basic idea in the mental examination or the neuropsychological evaluation is to actually evaluate these cognitive networks. So that's what we try to do in the neurology practice or in the neuropsychology lab. So as Professor Goldstein already mentioned, executive functions are very important for us. We have different sets of tests like trial making test or the Luria's consecutive drawings or hand movements tests or like Stroop test that we see here on the right bottom side. But the basic problem about these are they are rather subjective tests. So they are very, of course, they have a certain reliability, but they are rather subjective and they don't provide us any kind of an objective data. So that's why we started to use Moxo as a part of our neuropsychological evaluation, and we have very nice experience with it so far. So, and I will be presenting some of the cases we are evaluated so far. So just a brief overview about our center. So at DBU Neurological Sciences Center, it's one of the top referral centers in the region, serving mostly patients for cognitive problems and movement disorders. And including clinical trials and clinical practice, we have more or less around 1,000 Moxo test experience, and our practice, as well as experience with Moxo, mostly focus on cognitive disorders like Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, normal pressure hydrocephalus, and Parkinson's disease. So this case was presented back in 2014 in the National Alzheimer's Congress back in Istanbul, Turkey. So that's the first test I really get a really strong, some kind of a relation with the Moxo. This was also presented as an oral presentation by that time in the Congress. So just to briefly overview the patient, this was a 57 years old right-handed male with a university degree, working as an executive at a middle-sized company. He had some kind of progressive attention problems for over the last 2 years, and he was evaluated first in another center, first by neurology and followed by psychiatry. His neurological exam was completely normal, and brain imaging was normal by that time. Neuropsychological evaluation shows problems in sustained attention and some problems with the executive dysfunction. And by that time, he was diagnosed with an adult onset ADHD, and he was started on methylphenidate treatment. But over the time, there was no significant benefit from the medication. And he had several Moxos before the first diagnosis, also under the treatment, and there were no improvements under treatment by Moxo also. Because there was no improvement in the clinic under treatment, we have the suspicion when we first see the patient that it could be something else other than the ADHD. That's why we moved on for a further investigation with brain FDG PET-CT, which is a molecular imaging that we usually use for neurodegenerative disorders and cognitive disorders. And when we look at the FDG PET images here, I hope you can see my cursor. We have a severe hypometabolism in the frontal, temporal, and parietal regions, all through the cortex. Also, there's hypometabolism in the posterior cingulate cortex, which is more or less quite a typical signature of the Alzheimer's disease in the brain. So this PET imaging was very characteristic for an early onset Alzheimer's disease. So the basic point is that the patient was first had the suspicion or let's say the diagnosis of ADHD, adult onset ADHD in a different center, but there was no improvement under the medication by Moxo. That's why it gives some kind of an suspicion to us. And with the further investigation, we show that it's not actually ADHD as what Moxo also told to us. So early onset Alzheimer's disease is a very frequent problem in differential diagnosis in neurology practice. It starts before 65 years of age, and it's usually characterized by executive dysfunction and memory problems, which is called usually the frontal variant of Alzheimer's disease. As you know, the typical picture of the clinical picture of Alzheimer's disease is characterized by problems with memory, difficulty in problem solving, emotional problems, word finding difficulties, and misplacing items and so forth. And recent clinical trials and studies show that there's a long preclinical term in the continuum of Alzheimer's disease, more or less 10 to 15 years of time before the first symptoms starts, when we call it the mild cognitive impairment phase, the MCI phase, which is followed by dementia. And the current data shows that the pathogenesis relies to the toxicity of the amyloid beta accumulation in the brain. And there are a huge number of clinical trials going on worldwide focusing amyloid beta. And the basic thing about this is that these medications under development are actually targeting the very early phases of the disease. So that's why early detection, so reliable and objective tests are very important for diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So far, we had 24 patients with early onset Alzheimer's disease, 18 male and 6 females, and the mean age of it was 60.8. And the most common presenting symptoms were memory problems and behavioral changes. This is one of the typical patients with early onset Alzheimer's disease from our series. I can say that the change in the impulsivity score are very typical even from the early phase of the disease, that's why I mentioned the early diagnosis for the medication, because even in the very, very mild forms, more or less let's say almost the preclinical time, we can detect the change in the impulsivity scores of the patients with early onset Alzheimer's disease. It's probably because they are usually the frontal variant, they have more severe problems with frontal network, and that's why we can use Moxo very effectively here. One of the most common problems with the early onset Alzheimer's disease, differential diagnosis of frontotemporal lobar degeneration. It's a group of demanding disorders affecting frontal and temporal regions in the brain. And it's characterized by personality change, disinhibition, apathy, and language problems. It may be also sometimes accompanied by eating as well as some sexual behavioral problems also. As I said, it's actually a group of disorders, and there are 3 very frequent forms. The behavioral frontotemporal dementia is the most frequent type, and it's actually the most important disease in differential diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's disease. We had so far 14 patients with behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia. They were all males. Mean age was 58.4 years old. And what we have seen from our experience with the frontotemporal dementia patients with Moxo, that as I mentioned, we had the change in the impulsivity for the early onset Alzheimer's, whereas we have the change in the timing in the Moxo with frontotemporal dementia, especially with the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia. So HD was a 60 years old male who presented with apathy and personality change, and there were very mild findings in the routine neuropsychological evaluation, but using the Moxo, we detected some change. And so far we have this nice experience that I think the change in the timing is usually some kind of a signature for the frontotemporal dementia in this group of patients. The next patient, MD, is the previous patient's brother. He presented with actually total no symptoms at all. He was just to have some kind of a neurological checkup. There was no neurological examination findings, no imaging abnormalities, routine neurological evaluation was completely normal. But even in that time, he had this change in the Moxo very early in the disease, which makes a strong understanding for that we can use Moxo very effectively in this group of patients. And that's why now we are using it as a routine part of our neuropsychological evaluation. Normal pressure hydrocephalus is a disorder, especially we see in the later ages. It's due to the enlargement of the ventricles in the brain, which causes the clinical trial of cognitive impairment, gait problems, and urinary continence, and is treated by what we call the ventriculoperitoneal shunt operation that you see here. The shunt system drains the excessive cerebrospinal fluid from the ventricles, as you can see also here in the CT image. The important thing about the NPH is that first there is the problem of the differential diagnosis, and also the problem with the monitoring of the efficacy of the treatment. Because among all the demanding disorders, NPH is one of the few diseases that cause dementia that could be cured and treated totally if we detect the right patients early in the course of the disease. So even you have some cognitive impairment, gait problems, and urinary incontinence, if you detect the patient in the early course of the disease, then we can really provide some kind of a cure to this group of patients. So this was a patient first, you see the first evaluation including the Moxo, and then he had the ventriculoperitoneal shunt operation. And here you see the first month follow-up, third and the 6th month follow-up. You can see the dramatic improvement both in the clinic as well as you can see the change and improvements in the Moxo scores. Of course, we see a quite high number of cognitive problems, usually due to neurodegenerative disorders. This was a 67-year-old female that complained of memory problems for over the last 1 or 2 years. Her neurological examination was completely normal, so was her brain imaging and routine neuropsychological evaluation. So actually, her profile fits the what we call subjective cognitive impairment, but there's a mild problem with attention in the Moxo, and she was started on venlafaxine, and it was titrated up to 150 milligrams per day, and you can see the dramatic improvement in the Moxo scores in 6 months follow-up. So this is an example of a case that in very different profiles of cognitive impairments, from Alzheimer's disease to frontotemporal dementia to subjective cognitive impairment, Moxo can be used as a very reliable support tool and monitoring tool. A few words perhaps about the adult onset ADHD. There was some mention about the ADHD before in the previous lectures, and there will be some other discussions. So I will just mention maybe 1 or 2 words. This consensus statement was published last year. I highly recommend, if you are seeing adult patients, especially adult patients with ADHD, I would recommend to read through if you haven't done that so far. You know, one of the topics of this Agora symposium was to actually mention the changes in the unique things about the females with ADHD. So maybe I can just briefly say that even also in the adult ADHD patients, female patients, we need to pay attention to the clinic because they usually have a better coping mechanisms compared to males. So they usually present with mild symptoms, maybe a better course, but also they have usually comorbid problems like anxiety and depression. They usually cause problems in differential diagnosis, and because of the mild clinic compared to the males, as well as because it's usually with the inattentive profile compared to the impulsivity or the hyperactivity profile, it's usually less diagnosed, or patients are less likely to be referred to evaluation unless they are admitting themselves. So if you see an adult patient with a cognitive problem, you should always keep the adult onset ADHD in mind. More or less, I've said that all, but it's important that we should keep a clinical suspicion for females when we are evaluating the patients. Also, as I mentioned, inattentiveness is much prominent compared to the hyperactivity and impulsivity. So that sometimes cause some tricks in the diagnosis. And usually females have better coping strategies compared to males, which usually can mask the symptoms. So we should keep all these in mind, because if we miss the diagnosis or misdiagnose, it will have very detrimental consequences, just as the male patients. So the take-home message from my side would be, from our experience and practice, Moxo is a very objective and reliable test that we use for evaluating executive functions. It can be used in evaluation and monitoring of different profile of cognitive disorders. And as you have seen in the patients, we have discussed late onset cognitive problems can be due to different neurological and psychiatric diseases. And we should always keep in mind the adult onset ADHD, especially in females, because it has its own unique characteristics and it's very easy to misdiagnose or miss the diagnosis. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for the questions.
Thank you very much, Barish. We have already a few questions, but as I mentioned, we'll save it to the end. Our next speaker that joined us out of the road and just got it in the nick of time to join us is Professor Itai Berger. Itai heads the Pediatric Neurology Unit and the Neurocognitive Center at Assuta Hospital. He's a key opinion leader in the field of ADHD and has one of the largest ADHD clinics in Israel. Itai has over 103 published research and probably a bit more than that by now. And he's a very active researcher and scientific reviewer. Itai was also instrumental in the design and validation of the Moxo test, and still, being creative as he is very active in the local startup ecosystem in Israel. I'm honored to welcome Professor Berger as our next speaker.
Thank you very much. Sorry for being late. I would say the chaotic ecosystem of high-tech in Israel, but that's life. Okay, I'm going to talk about ADHD among children with chronic diseases. And I think I'll keep the question, is it the same disorder, a bit open in the end. Let's start with it and see what do we know about it. Sorry, just a minute. Whoop. Okay. That's my disclosure, and we'll start.
I think Itai, we're seeing side by side your presentation and your notes.
Yeah,
so maybe you want to put it on full. Exactly.
Whoops. Here we are. Sorry. Okay. So we're when we're talking about children and adolescents with chronic illness, they have medical and cognitive fragility, which is combined with special and sometimes intensive care needs that are not easily met by existing healthcare and education models. As anybody who works in a hospital knows, it's always complicated. And currently we're in a situation that more children than ever in history survive critical medical conditions and suffer from long-term chronic disorders. Now, these medical successes in survivorship have likely also resulted in rising rates of complications and in children becoming chronic disordered children. When I started my internship in medicine in the previous millennia, most of the children died from acute leukemia, which is now a chronic disorder. So really things are changing. Now, regardless of the underlying diagnosis, all these children share similar and functional consequences, including intensive hospital and community-based service, and so on. They have polypharmacy, they have home care, and they should maintain a basic quality of life. And they have risk and frequent prolonged hospitalization, which leads to high health resources utilization. Now, if they also have ADHD with other chronic disorders, the use of more healthcare money, they may be even less adherent to treatment plans. That's one option to look at.
Itai, I'm just interrupting because we're seeing the same slide, the introduction slide.
Yeah, I'll move in a minute.
Oh, okay, just want to make sure that
what I want to say is that there's a lot of work done about how to improve the quality of primary care for children and adolescents with chronic disorders, but we don't know enough about the connection between chronic health conditions and ADHD symptoms. I want to say that we don't know enough about the chronic health conditions and cognitive impairment, and I want to focus my discussion about the ADHD symptoms. Now, we suspect that among children with chronic disorders or chronic health conditions, there's lower recognition and treatment levels of ADHD. Now, that generalization is not often accompanied by a discussion of specific conditions, and even more rarely accompanied by evidence or well understood. Any approach promoting and improving early and accurate diagnosis and treatment, as well as disparity prevention, must take this into account. Now, this talk illuminates these problems, and I'll provide some stimulus, I hope, to approach ADHD among children and adolescents with other chronic conditions. Now, let's see, what do we have? I will start with some specific diseases or disorders. Let's start with diabetes mellitus. We know that developing diabetes within the first 4 to 7 years of life appears to be a particularly potent risk factor for cognitive complication, and is most often associated with clinical significant cognitive deficit. Children with diabetes, diagnosed and treated, perform more poorly on measures of intelligence and on tests of attention, psychomotor speed, and rapid information processing. And the sooner they started to be sick with diabetes, the worse for the long term. I can't, only diabetes can take 20 minutes, so I'll just say a few words about several studies. On the top right, you see that adolescents with type 1 diabetes mellitus and ADHD require specific support from healthcare professionals because they adhere to the insulin treatment poorly than other children without ADHD. You have to be very attentive and very careful and with very good executive functions in order to follow the insulin treatment. On the left side, on the top, you see that maternal gestation diabetes mellitus during pregnancy has higher risk of ADHD in offspring. So if I'm looking on the first study, we could say this is because of glucose levels. And if they'll be with normal glucose levels, they'll be more attentive. But the maternal gestation diabetes proved something which is not completely right, because even what does the glucose of the mother has to do with long-term complications of ADHD in the child? When we look on the downside, association of attention deficit disorder with diabetes mellitus in US adults. So it's not just gestation adolescents, it's also in adults. And when we look on the study with our study, recent study that is not, it wasn't published, still under review, we show that impaired attention function in children with type 1 diabetes is connected to the age, to the level of glucose, but is independent from these measures when you compare them to children without diabetes on the same age and with the same genetics. Diabetes by itself is connected somehow, we'll understand why, to more ADHD and other cognitive deficits in these children. That was one disease. Let's talk about cystic fibrosis. something which is completely different. Again, our study about ADHD symptoms in patients with cystic fibrosis. And in this study, we have almost 175 patients, adults and children as well. We saw that the occurrence of ADHD symptoms in patients with cystic fibrosis is substantially higher than in the general population. It reached 18%, 16%, even more. And we suggested that it should be recognized as a comorbidity of CF. The interesting thing in this study was that adults with ADHD, usually in the general population, adults are diagnosed less than children. Children have higher rates of ADHD than adults. In the CF population, it's the other way around. The longer years you suffer from CF, meaning the older you are, the occurrence of ADHD is higher. Let's move to something, again, completely different. I'm very busy with that, as you can see, because I'm looking on chronic disorders. Children with FMF, familial Mediterranean fever, again, have increased prevalence of ADHD. It was diagnosed in 32%, almost 33% of FMF patients, which is extremely high. And the high prevalence of ADHD characteristic in children with FMF may support what we call the neuroimmune hypothesis, that chronic inflammation increases the risk for ADHD. When we look on this study, I'm not involved this time, from 2018, on adult ADHD and comorbid somatic disorder. This is a systematic literature review. Significant association are found between adult ADHD and several somatic diseases. They speak about higher rates of ADHD among patients with asthma, with celiac, with atopic dermatitis, with rheumatoid arthritis, and with lupus. There are several explanations. I think that the neuroimmune hypothesis provide us with relatively good explanation, and the explanation is chronic inflammation. This is also true for children and adults with different cancer types, with other neurological disorders, pulmonary disease, bone and joint disease, metabolic disorders, autoimmune disorders like IBD, and multiple sclerosis and other. We think that there is a potential link between chronic disease, inflammation, and ADHD. We think that inflammatory cytokines, especially those expressed during the early developmental stage of brain development, like in mothers with diabetes, may alter nascent development neuronal pathways and affecting subsequent cognition and behavior for many years later in the child's brain. There's a direct effect of inflammatory cytokines, like in FMF, in diabetes, and in cystic fibrosis. They are crossing the blood-brain barrier, and they are activating neuroimmune mechanisms that can also explain the higher rates of ADHD. When we look on this research from 2017 about genetic relation among psychiatric and immune-related phenotypes based on genome-wide association data, we see that this study identified a number of intriguing and previously unreported genetic relations, some which appear to localize near established risk factors for complex diseases, including ADHD and inflammatory disorders. We must be careful because on the whole, these findings are consistent with the idea that similar signatures of common genetic variation may increase risk for both psychiatric and immune-related disorders, but it is important to keep in mind that these findings do not necessarily imply causality. We have several explanations. It might be mediated by activation of HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, and adrenal, causing increased levels of glucocorticoids and leading to alteration of cortex and anterior cingulate cortex area, which are associated with later cognitive ADHD and memory function. The main question here is that it might be even stronger in children with genetic predisposition to ADHD, but it might occur in children that do not have any predisposition, and that inflammatory disorder by itself is causing ADHD symptoms that otherwise cannot be explained genetically. There are some in vitro studies that show that pro-inflammatory cytokine, like interleukin-1 beta, can cause neuronal death via their direct effect on neurons, again, in ADHD-related areas. And the data suggest the possibility that chronic exposure to increased concentration of this interleukin may influence neurodevelopmental processes leading to increased prevalence of ADHD. That might explain the issue that adults with CF who are exposed to inflammation more years than children have higher rates of ADHD. There's a very interesting study by Joel Nigg and his team about neuroinflammation as a risk factor for ADHD. And they summarize this study by saying that there are accumulating evidence from human studies and animal models that they're still incomplete and we don't understand everything, but that support a potential role for neuroinflammation in the pathophysiology of ADHD. This might affect the diagnostic process and the treatment, which I don't have right now time to talk about. So I want to go to the bottom line. Is ADHD and chronic inflammation is the same disorder as, let's call it, regular ADHD? I must say that I'm not sure. We don't really know. Since ADHD is the most common neurodevelopmental disorders and in childhood and among the most prevalent chronic health conditions, we hypothesize that chronic disease is a major influential factor regarding cognitive and behavioral processes, including ADHD. We have shown, as I showed you, widespread negative outcome of chronic disease on ADHD. And although these children are at risk of poorer health due to the combination of both ADHD and chronic illness, there are relatively few well-characterized clinical initiative and research effort devoted to improving their care in this aspect. And it seems that more work is needed to develop and provide interventions and diagnoses that are directly target ADHD of children with chronic disorders. So my to-do list is to search for symptoms, even in children who are not genetically prone to ADHD. You should ask about it and monitor that. Children, adolescents, and of course adults. We should be updated on what we already know about it, and the data is fastly accumulating and change the practice parameters. We should confirm diagnosis of ADHD in suspected children, and we should treat them appropriately. The question here, an unanswered question, is it possible that if we'll be more strict or conservative about their inflammation, like in FMF, for example, will we improve their attention skills, or is it the other way around? We should treat ADHD in order to improve their inflammation in FMF? I have suspicions, but I don't have an answer. And I think that there are more studies that we should do. We are still doing about it. I guess that at least in some children, if you decrease the amount of inflammation, you might improve some of the ADHD symptoms, but I'm not sure about it. Thank you for listening. And I think the message is, although late, is clear.
Thank you very much, Itai. That was a fascinating presentation, and there will be plenty of questions, I'm sure. So our next speaker, Dr. Alison Aviv, is a clinical psychologist and an American board-certified pediatric neuropsychologist. Dr. Aviv has extensive experience and expertise in accurate diagnosis of ADHD, learning difficulties, dyslexia, ASD, developmental issues, emotional disorders, behavioral disorders, and adjustment difficulties. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Aviv as our final clinical speaker.
Thanks so much, Itai, Ohad, and it was a pleasure to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues, and I'm thrilled to be here this evening. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's pull it up. Okie dokie, and let's go to, let's see where we are. Okay, I'm not finding where to show it.
I think it's on the bottom part of the right.
On the bottom right.
There, more.
Yeah, just yeah, exactly. Just one more right. Yeah,
there
this
we
one.
go.
Exactly.
Okay. Okie dokie, and I want to go to, no, I'm in the wrong place. Sorry about that. Let's just, oops, let's pull it right up to the top. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. No, not quite sure why that is not popping up, because this is what I have on my screen. Sorry about that. Let's see. Always some technicality. Let's try this again. Okay, are you able to see this screen now? Or?
No.
Actually, no. Let me share the screen with your presentation.
Yeah,
okay?
would you mind? That would be helpful. I'm not
no problem.
To pull it up.
Just let me know that you see the presentation.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, I can see it. Okay, sorry about that. Okay.
No problem.
So, so I have a clinic in Ra'anana. I see a lot of children, and I see a lot of children who are bilingual. So I'm going to speak a little bit, not only about gender and culture issues, but I'm going to talk about culture in terms of bilingualism as well. If you could put the next slide up, please, Ohad. Obviously, we've been talking. It's always fun to go as the last speaker because everyone's covered lots of the relevant issues. The one that I wanted to talk about here really is how I think about ADHD also is, in terms of emotional and behavioral dysregulation. Even though emotional dysregulation isn't really part of the DSM criteria, I think we all know intuitively what that looks like in the children that we evaluate and we treat. Although we are looking at the sets of symptoms of inattention and then the axis of hyperactivity and impulsivity. Next slide, please. So we've talked about these symptoms, and I know that you all understand what we're talking about, but I thought I'd just put them up there for people to pay attention to, because working clinically and working with these kids on a day-to-day basis, these are the things we look for. I'm process trained. I was trained in the Boston model. And everything that I do with kids when I evaluate them, and when I'm evaluating, I'm usually doing a full neuropsychological battery. I'm looking for evidence of all of these symptoms in all of the tasks that I do with children. I had a sweet little girl in the clinic the other day whose inattention was very apparent. And she kept saying, "I didn't hear you clearly," every time she had been distracted by something that was pulling her attention elsewhere. So when we listen carefully to children, we can hear them tell us through their behavior and through their words exactly what it is that we're looking for. Next slide, please. Hyperactivity. Thanks. Hyperactivity, obviously, again, we see in the clinic. These are the kids at the end of an assessment that we're tired in our evaluation, because we've had to do lots and lots of work managing some of these behaviors and trying to keep them engaged in the tasks that they're doing for us. They're on and off of their seats, they're under the table, and this is what we hear from their teachers and their parents as well. Next slide, and just to talk briefly about impulsivity. Obviously, these are kids that can't inhibit their responses to anything that's going on in their environment. And obviously, we're hearing this from parents and teachers as well as seeing it in our clinical evaluation. So I want to spend most of the time today talking about culture issues, and I'm going to spend actually less time talking about gender issues, although I have some more slides about that because my colleagues have already touched, I think, on most of what we know about gender issues. In terms of culture issues, I think it's really important to understand how different cultures have really different expectations and different tolerances of the kinds of behaviors that we're talking about. And I think probably the best example I can give you of this is actually not necessarily from an ADHD perspective, but just from a cultural perspective. So I'm originally English, and I spent about 23 years in the US, and my children were all born there. I have 4 children. And every summer we would do what we called the grandparent trip. We would hop on a plane and we'd stop in England to visit my parents, and then we'd come to Israel to visit my husband's parents. And then back to the US. So my kids are fairly typical American kids. I mean, now they're grown up, but at the time, they're fairly typical American kids. We'd land in England, and suddenly my children were looked at in comparison to their cousins and in comparison to the children around them. And basically the message I was getting was, my goodness, your children are wild animals, because compared to their British cousins, their behavior was very different. I would get to Israel, and the grandparents and the cousins would say, these are the best behaved children we have ever seen. They are so polite and they're so well behaved. And these are the same children exhibiting the same behaviors in 3 different cultures in the space of a few weeks. So what does that inform us? It informs us, I think, of what we know from the literature, that different cultures simply tolerate children's behaviors in different ways. And when we're looking at normal or abnormal behaviors or behaviors that are impacting children on a daily basis, we must understand it in the context of culture. How does this play a role, for instance, when we're working with immigrant cultures in a country like Israel? We have to understand where the child and where their parents came from, because the way we interpret their behavior is going to be different. It will be very unusual, for instance, for a British-born immigrant female child to come to the attention of their Israeli teacher, okay? Because that child is probably sitting very quietly at the back of the classroom, behaving impeccably and maybe completely inattentive and not coming to the attention of the teacher for a referral for ADHD. So those cultural influences are huge. And diagnosis and treatment is very, very much influenced by culture. I see kids in the clinic from a variety of different cultures, and the way parents rate on the subjective behavior forms that we provide them with is really interesting. The literature is very clear that there's not a great correlation between objective measures and subjective measures. So are we measuring the same thing, or are we measuring different things? And how do we account for those differences when we make diagnoses? So we have to understand parents and culture. We have to also understand parenting style. So when I do an intake, I get a lot of information about how these parents parent their children. We know from the literature that authoritative parenting, so parenting that is very warm, very nurturant, but also where there are very clear expectations of behavior, those parents tend to have kids with lower rates of ADHD. Those families have lower rates versus very authoritarian households. Those households tend to have higher rates. So understanding parenting style is also important. I think probably the most important thing I want to say here is that when we're making an ADHD diagnosis, we have to be culturally competent as clinicians. We have to understand the parents and the children and the culture that they were raised in and the culture that they're living in and how those things interact with each other. I'm not going to talk much about the different paradigms, except to say that I think that looking at the different cultures in the literature, we see different ways of thinking about ADHD. For instance, the American model is very much a biological psychopharmaceutical paradigm, where we're looking at a neurodevelopmental disorder. And when we look at more Asian cultures, when children behave in ways that we recognize as ADHD, we see parents talk about feeling that they're failing as parents and teachers feeling as failures as teachers in the classroom to work with these children, rather than looking at the child's neurobiology as contributory to what they're seeing. I'm not going to talk much about the Milwaukee study, except that it suggests to us that we really are dealing with a neurobiological disorder, because we're looking also at longitudinal outcomes for treated and untreated children, and they show us quite clearly the benefits, obviously, of pharmacological treatment for kids over the lifespan with ADHD. So I think that we know as clinicians very clearly that the etiology of ADHD is a very complex interplay of genetic and environmental factors. I mentioned Asian cultures earlier. There's some really interesting discussions in the literature about how we look at ADHD from different cultural perspectives. One of the articles that I read recently talks about how ADHD medication in China is thought of as the wise drug, because in that culture, the desire for children to be smart causes parents to want to do whatever it is that they can do to increase the child's learning capacity. And that's a way that parents view this particular medication. We know lots of things about socioeconomic status in ADHD diagnoses, also a cultural type issue, in the fact that lower socioeconomic status families tend to have higher rates of ADHD diagnosed in their children. So I think the push here, when we look at cultural issues, is really making a push for culturally sensitive norms. One of the things that I know Adhd in the development of the Moxo, that there are culturally sensitive norms from a number of different cultures. And I think that's important. It certainly brings up the issue when we're dealing in an immigrant culture of what norms to use. And that's an issue that I face on a daily basis when I'm working with bilingual kids who, you know, some of the English speaking kids I work with may have been born here in Israel, but they're being raised in Israeli culture outside of the home, but inside the home, their homes are very British or very American or South African. Some of these children even don't have very good Hebrew. Which is a very interesting space to be, because you wonder sort of how this develops, but we'll talk about the impact of language. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the measurement issue is clear. What norms are we using when we are using either subjective measures, like rating scales, or when we're using objective measures like a Moxo and other types of tests? Let's go on to the next slide. I'm going to just mention some gender issues. We've heard from almost every speaker today, and I'll just reiterate that boys are much more likely to be referred and to be treated for ADHD. Girls are much more likely to be missed. They're less disruptive in the classroom, and therefore they're less likely to be referred. So this becomes very interesting, because when we look at the epidemiology suggests that boys have a higher rate of ADHD than girls. But I guess it depends very much on how they're being referred in the first place. And there's sort of a referral bias here. Another speaker mentioned that girls seem to have better coping mechanisms, and they better mask or they better manage their symptoms. I think if we look at this from a neurological perspective, sometimes I think about this in terms of maybe the larger corpus callosum that we see in girls versus boys, and the fact that girls are much better at multitasking and boys seem to be better at sequential tasking. And that might be playing a role here too. So the gender ratio rates that we see in the literature, from anywhere from 2 to 1 to 10 to 1, depending on where we're looking, suggests that it has to do a little bit with how referral actually happens. We know that boys are very much more likely to have comorbid externalizing disorders, and girls much more likely to have comorbid internalizing disorders. I find that in my clinic referrals, and not only have I been working in Israel for 7 years, but I had almost 20 years of a large clinic in the US. And I found there and here that girls are much more likely to be referred for a neuropsych evaluation for a learning disability. And what we find along the way, because we know that kids with ADHD have about a 50% comorbidity rate for learning disabilities, we find along the way that these girls often have attention deficit disorder as well. So it's interesting when you think about the referral question, when you meet with families before you assess children, it's very interesting to hear what it is that they think they're referring their child for. And as a neuropsychologist, I have a very specific bias. I like to evaluate kids in their entirety. I like to do a full neuropsych evaluation. I don't like to just give rating scales and a Moxo or a CPT test, because I want to look at them engaging in various different tasks. I want to look for convergent evidence across what I'm observing in terms of their on-task and off-task behavior, but the way they go about doing the tasks. The results sometimes just simply need to be explained through the process that you observe. And I'll give a very simple example. I can give a child who's come in for a neuropsych evaluation. Let's say I give them a timed math task. And because they're very careless and inattentive, they don't pay attention to the math sign. So they may get a very low score, relatively low score on a speeded math task. And obviously the wrong conclusion would be to say that they've got a difficulty with math processing. The way to figure that out then would be to give them separate tasks where you look at their speed of addition, speed of subtraction, and speed of multiplication, but note the fact that the carelessness exists in the task performance. So there are many different ways that we can use our observations when we're testing kids using various different tasks to look for convergent evidence of their inattention and their carelessness and their hyperactivity and their impulsivity. So I think that gender differences in clinic referrals are very much due to referral bias. And really, we need to be looking carefully at the attention issues in kids who are not necessarily, and especially in girls who are not referred necessarily for an attention disorder. Let's go on to the next slide. What I want to talk about here a little bit is some of the data around research on CPTs. And, you know, there's good meta-analytic data looking at various CPTs that boys are much more likely to have impulsive errors, but there is no real difference amongst boys and girls in omission errors. So that's really interesting, I think, from looking at that data. And it makes, I think the suggestion is that actually it's response inhibition and not attention deficit that might be in fact controlled by gender, which is, I think, something to look carefully at, because response inhibition we can watch very carefully as we're working with children. It's really all about self-control, the choice of selecting the appropriate behavior and inhibiting whatever that prepotent response is that we may want to be showing. There's a lovely study, there's a lovely Moxo study that brings to light the question of distractors. How do distractors differ, or do they differ by gender? And the Moxo study, in the 2019 study, suggests that the distractors do not have a gender difference. So there might be some sort of dissociation going on here between the way that gender and measurement method interact. That if we're measuring ADHD based on subjective report, we're likely to get more inattention being reported for girls. When we're looking at CPT data, boys are likely to show us more impulsive errors. And so the Moxo study was similar to previous research on the correlations between CPT data and these subjective questionnaires. The correlation is not great. And so measurement variance, I think, is very relevant here. All of us have different ways of evaluating kids that are referred. One of the things I like to do when I give questionnaires because, obviously all of the good questionnaires that we're using have validity criteria built into them. But I've found sometimes that by the time kids get referred to our clinics, parents are really pulling their hair out. By the time they actually get around to a referral, the child's behavior has really gotten quite extreme. And so what we often see on these questionnaires is what I call undifferentiated parent screaming, like all of the scales are elevated. And so the question is, okay, can I rely on this parent's data or not? This questionnaire looks valid, but everything's a problem. It's very interesting. Those kids in the clinic, one-on-one in the clinic, look nothing like the rating scales that their parents have described, which is also an interesting observation. But I usually give something like an SRS, which is a questionnaire we use in diagnosis of autism. And I often find that the parents who have very undifferentiated behavioral questionnaires would also be rating their child as severely autistic, which tells us something really just about the distress level of parents in managing their child's behavior. So I take a lot of these questionnaires with a little bit of a pinch of salt, and it really tells me a lot more about the difficulty of the child functioning in the home rather than specific diagnoses. So why do I mention that? Because I think we have to be looking at multiple sources of behavior measurement. I'll get to that in my last slide, but I want to speak first about a little bit just about language issues and the interaction with ADHD as well. So I'm just going to go to my next slide, if that's okay. Ohad, can you? Thank you. So I'm going to go to the one after that. So as I said, I do a lot of work with immigrant children. And not surprisingly, children who have language delays are often referred for an evaluation of ADHD. It's in the literature, and Itai, one of your studies that you were involved with in 2020 also mentions the association between language delay and ADHD. It's always interesting to me when I get a child who has very poor skills in their instructional language that the referral is often for ADHD. So imagine that you're sitting in a classroom and the teacher's blathering on in a language that you don't really understand. You're going to switch off pretty fast. So these kids will often get that referral, and they will, if we're not looking carefully and we don't bother to look at the language issue, or we don't evaluate it in the context of a good assessment, we may make a misdiagnosis. Inattention, of course, it's a cycle. It's correlated with poorer academic skills, and language delay also plays a role here. So if you don't understand what's happening, you switch off, you're not picking up the skills that are being taught in the classroom, and then anxiety plays its role too, and we get a whole mishmash of all of these disorders going on in a comorbid fashion. So I want you to pay attention to the fact that girls are much more likely to get a referral for a learning disability diagnosis. And therefore, we want to be very careful that when that referral comes, that we're looking carefully at attention deficit diagnoses as well. There has to be a really careful analysis of even what language we are testing kids in. I've seen some awful stuff here where kids who are not fluent Hebrew speakers will be tested in Hebrew, and obviously their intellectual scores look a lot lower than really is the case. We have to be aware of the fact that it takes 5 to 10 years for academic language to come into play. It only takes 6 months to 2 years for interpersonal language competence. Basic interpersonal competence, language competence comes into play fairly fast. These kids can chit-chat on the playground fairly well, but they may have very weak skills in academic language. What's interesting when I'm working with this population here is that I find some of these kids are almost sort of alingual in the sense that at home, let's say they're being raised in an English-speaking family somewhere in Israel. at home, what do kids talk to their parents about? There's lots of research about how parents don't speak to their kids very much on a daily basis, but kids and parents talk about what they're going to eat for dinner, maybe what they did at school, maybe what activity they're going to after school, maybe what clothes they're wearing in the morning if we're talking about younger children, but it's a very limited vocabulary. And if they're going to school and their Hebrew language is not very good and they're not understanding what's going on at school, it turns out that their Hebrew vocabulary isn't so strong either. And when you start to actually evaluate vocabulary in both languages, there's not a whole lot going on there. And so these kids are very, very likely to be referred for inattention to our clinic. So it's important that when we evaluate the kids, that we evaluate them in both languages, that we evaluate the skills in both languages. But when we're doing tasks such as the Moxo, really important, I mean, this may seem trivial to many of you, but it's really important to make sure that you're playing the instructional language in the language that the kid is strongest in. So that they really understand the instructions of what it is that they're doing. I want to go on and talk a little bit more about measurement issues in assessment. And then I think I'll stop. So I've only got a couple minutes left. So I've spoken a little bit about objective versus subjective measures. I want to talk about all the other things that should go into a comprehensive assessment. And of course, again, I'm biased because this is my training model is to do, complete neuropsych assessments, but I find them very useful. And the psychiatrists and neurologists I work with, I think, find them useful too. Getting a really good history is imperative, not only a medical history, a sleep history. I find I spend a lot of time when I do an intake in Israel versus when I was in the States of getting parents to try to regulate their kids' sleep before they come in here. I think this is one of the few countries in the world where kids stay up a whole lot later than they should. That's probably my English upbringing too. But sleep-deprived kids are not going to do well on a CPT task. Behavioral observation, everything I do, everything I'm doing with children, as I said, I'm process trained. I'm looking at their behaviors all of the time. Subjective measures I've already talked about. How do we use those questionnaires? But even in self-report, I think it's really, really important to ask kids what they mean when they tell us that they're struggling with attention. I'll give you an example of a child I evaluated once, who I think a 10-year-old boy who gave me the best explanation I've ever heard of inattention. I said to him, what happens when you say you sort of get lost in the classroom? So he said, well, I'll give you an example. He said, today the teacher was teaching us fractions and she drew a fruit bowl on the board and we had to calculate what percentage or what fraction of the fruit bowl was bananas and what fraction was apples. And he said, so I started thinking about the fruit bowl. And then I thought about the fruit bowl at camp, at my summer camp. And then I thought about all my summer camp friends that I hadn't seen for a few months. He said, and then when I finally stopped thinking about all of these things, the math teacher wasn't there anymore. And there was another teacher at the front of the room teaching something else entirely. So it was a very rich explanation of what happens to these children. I find when I simply ask children, what do you mean when you can't sit still? What do you do? What do you do when you're not paying attention to the teacher? I get such rich clinical information. And sometimes I think we get very stuck on giving measures and not talking to kids and hearing. And when you talk to kids and you listen to what they say, they tell you very clearly what's going on. And then you can see it in the measures that you give. So obviously objective measures, we're going to be looking for data patterns. Because this stuff doesn't correlate so well, we want to look for evidence in different ways. So obviously our CPT, our Moxo evidence gives us some fantastic data. I like to look at the split between cognitive efficiencies, working memory processing speed versus their reasoning skills on an intelligence scale. I like to look at something like affect recognition. How well do they recognize faces? Because there's lots of literature that suggests that kids with attention disorders struggle with recognizing affect efficiently. When we give them tasks that they have to balance being speedy and being accurate, not only on the CPT, but paper and pencil trail tasks. How do they do there? Looking at tasks that pull for organization and planning skills, tower tasks, trails tasks, Stroop tasks, looking for inhibition skills, how they monitor their work as they're going. And I find that when I put all of these data together, I can be much more confident about the diagnosis that I'm giving and much more able to help parents make decisions about treatment options. So from where I sit in a very clinical space, not having a whole lot of time to evaluate data, although I've got lots of it. I have it in databases. I just never get around to putting it together. I feel very privileged to work in this field, helping improve the lives of children and their families through good assessment and through treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in the work that I do with my colleagues. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to all my colleagues. Ohad, we can't hear you, you're on mute.
Right, thank you very much, Alison. It was a fascinating talk. I would actually like to thank all of you wonderful speakers for your interesting presentations. And just before we open up for discussions and some questions from the audience, I want to welcome our product director, Mr. Aviram Salomon, to share with you in a bit more detail our latest developments in the Moxo. Amazing things that I know that many of you have been asking for a long time now. And for the audience out there, if you want to take this opportunity also to think about questions and just post them on the Q&A, and we'll address them as soon as Aviram finishes his session. Thank you. Aviram, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you all. Let me share the screen. Okay, can you see?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today. It was fascinating. My name is Aviram. I am the product manager of the Moxo for a couple of years. I'm in Neurotech for 11 years already and filled a couple of positions as QA technical support. And please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section. And based on your feedbacks, we have made significant changes to our regular Moxo report and added a new report called Treatment Evaluation Report. These reports will be available in the system soon. First, we will start with a Moxo Cpt Report. A new layout will replace the current Moxo report, but don't worry, it includes the same outputs as in the current Moxo report, but with additional information and better graphics. We have implemented a new and modern updated design. The clinic could now add its own logo, phone number, address, website, URL into the report. The logo will be displayed in the header and the clinic details in the footer, as you can see here in the picture. Another additional improvement was in the norm comparison table. An above average Z-score values will be displayed. And also in the performance graph, the y-axis values will display performance score from 100 to -100. Today, we display only scores from 0 to 100. And after receiving feedbacks from customers and many discussions on this issue, we have decided that there is a place to see in the graph also the score under 0 and limit it to -100, as it reflects the reliability and validity of the patient performance better this way. This is one of our exciting improvements in the report. We have added a standardized performance range graph for each index, ATI age. We have created a standardized range based on general population data. The standardized range provides a visual description of the individual performance compared to the general population. It is colored, if you can see here in the picture, it is colored in gray and displays the average standard deviation, the minimum and the maximum standard deviation as collected in the general population. The next section is also new and we describe it as an interpreted section. We added a performance summary table. This table described the influence of the distractors, the visual, audio, and combined, and 2 new indices that influence on the patient's performance. We're talking about sustained performance and distractor load. We will describe later the definitions of these indices. The last section of the report is a summary section. It includes the background and observation that you filled in the system, and it will be displayed here. And also a personalized automatic report summary section. It includes a summary of distractors' influences on performance of the patient. Okay, this section here, if you can see my mouse. So these were the improvements for the regular Moxo Cpt report. And now we're gonna talk about the treatment evaluation report. It is a new report. We're very excited to present it to you as it has the potential to make your life easier. First, a new designed non-comparison graphics that compares the Z-scores of 2 administered tests, including Z-score differences summary. Same as the new and improved Moxo report, this report also displays the standardized range, but this time it's for both the pre and post test, which makes it very easy to compare and make sense of. As you can see here, the blue line is the first test, the black line is the second, and here the gray one is the
average. I think Avram is frozen. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think Avram dropped out.
Oh dear.
Okay, he'll be back in a second. Let's go ahead and address some of the questions in the meantime until Avram joins us. So there is actually a question that was posted while Professor Cesar was speaking from Revital Kirchenberg from Israel. And she's saying, hello, is it possible from your point of view that a significant number of children are misdiagnosed with ODD and maybe their challenging behavior can be better understood due to poor or lack of executive functions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right on the spot. It's very easy to diagnose oppositional defiant disorder, but to me, it's just like when you're saying this child has fever. It's just a very unspecific. You need to go underneath and what's going on under the negative behavior. And sometimes you find that they're just not paying any attention to what they're saying. And then as Dr. Aviv is saying, depending on the parents' pressure, you can get a negative reaction. And also, the other thing that sometimes I find is that there actually many kids don't hear what the parents are saying because they're embedded in their own thoughts. So then the parents have said the order 3, 4, 5 times. They're upset because there's no response. And then they say, I'm telling you to come to dinner. And then the kid suddenly says, what are you screaming at me? And then they get into a fight. So it's both inattention and also impulsivity could play a factor. So I always say, look under the ODD. You cannot have just a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. You have to have something, that is causing that.
I think there's certainly some literature that suggests that there's sort of a developmental progression, like an untreated ADHD will often sort of then manifest as ODD and then manifest as conduct disorder later on. So I think that whenever we're looking at a question about oppositional defiant behaviors, we have to be evaluating ADHD and executive dysfunctions.
Exactly. And that's why it's important, the longitudinal history, like what happened in the beginning, how did this child end up here, and and that you get it clinically. You get it clinically also from different sources, like the parent report and the teacher reports.
I actually have a question for the panel. So we are in this COVID-19 era. I heard 2 weeks ago that it was for the first time referred to as an era. And children now have to study from home using Zoom. So how is this affecting children with ADHD, we talk about girls versus boys. How do you see the differences there? How are they accustomed to this kind of learning, and how is their difficulties coming into play?
I think there's a bimodal distribution. For some kids with ADHD, it was fabulous. And for some kids with ADHD, it was an absolute disaster. And we can explain both of those patterns.
Yeah, I have a lot of kids with, for example, separation anxiety or school phobia who love it, but now they're completely stuck. They cannot come back. And I get a lot of, if he had that and this kid was very scared of going to school, that was heaven for them, but now they can't come back. We have also to think about what is it for a child, who's in 6th or 7th grade, who's never been to a regular school, because they were in kindergarten, they never went to 1st grade, they're now in 3rd grade, and they've missed, they've missed almost 2 years of social interaction.
Aviram, we see your screen. Okay, here we go. So, sorry, let's continue. Are you with us, Aviram?
I think Aviram is on mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Yeah, you can continue.
1 second. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm sorry for the technical issue. We were at the report summary. At the report summary of the treatment evaluation report. So actually, what we did is we made the summary automated, and so we don't need actually to write it or up or copy it from other sections of the report. There are two main parts for this section. The first section is the summary of the norm comparison differences between the first and second administered test, and the summary of the distractors' influences on the performance based on the first administered test only. Okay.
Aviram, we actually didn't also see the page before that. So if you could also show that and explain it, that'll be great.
Yeah. Okay, here we have the distractors impact performance table, where in the past comparing the effects of the distractors between the various stages and between 2 tests was complicated. Today, it's all done for you automatically. Okay, you will be able to assess the distractor effect and the sustained performance in a blink of an eye. And we even made a comparative summary to help you even further. So all you really need to do is examine this table. Okay, we have here in this table the results are displayed as improved performance, decreased performance, and unchanged performance. And this is the summarized section that we talked about before. Let's talk about some terms that we added to the reports. We have the standardized performance graph. The purpose of the standardized range graph is to evaluate the performance of the individual patient by comparing the individual performance to that of the general population. And we have the distractors impact performance table. The table describes the influence of the distractors and 2 new values, the sustained performance and the distractor load on the patient performance. Now let's talk about these new 2 values. We have the sustained performance. We describe it as the ability to perform well over a long period of time. In the Moxo, we evaluate that by comparing the last level to the baseline level, level 8 to level 1. And when we're talking about the visual, auditory, and combined distractor, we are checking the influence of the distractors on the patient performance. In the Moxo, we compare each of the distractor levels to the baseline level. And combine the distraction load actually is the influence of the distraction load, the effect of the load of the distractors on performance, which may allude to cognitive load. In the Moxo, we calculate this index by summarizing all differences in each one of the distractors, each one of the visual, auditory, and combined distractors. Okay. And finally, the current Moxo report will still be available to you for the period of 3 months, so we can get used to the new one. We need to say that if the clinic does not add their details, the Neurotech company details will appear in the report as a default. The treatment evaluation report is for comparing 2 tests only. And the standardized performance range graph is available till the age of 26. We will add soon the standardized range for the ages of 27 and above. And that's it. Thank you all. And I want to say happy birthday to Ohad. Today's your birthday. Finally.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Aviram. You can stop the share now. And let's continue with the discussion. Okay, there's a general question here from Rochelle. She's asking a question related to Moxo, actually, about the standard of using Moxo. She's saying that one of the things that we say is for the parents to avoid the child eating something sweet or like choco, like a cacao or bread with chocolate before they do the Moxo. And she's asking if there is an influence of nutrition, some sort of nutrition, to the performance of a child in the Moxo test. What's your experience, and if you have something to share on that aspect? Open question to anyone.
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of talking about the influence of diet, and you know, there are specific kids who react negatively to a specific kind of food, but there's no evidence that sugar is going to go one way or another. The only thing that maybe is associated with some more problems is artificial coloring of the food. So, you know, don't get a full bag of orange Doritos right immediately before whatever you're doing, but you shouldn't be doing it anyway. So I would say that they should have, you know, and also if they have been like starving for a long time, they're probably not going to be having a good performance. So, you know, have them at a time, test them at a time that they're relaxed and they're, you know, not very far away from a meal, but not immediately after a huge meal. So they're not extremely tired. Normal situation, I would say.
By the way, a personal question: have you heard anything research-based with regards to the effect of omega-3 on ADHD? Because there's a bit of a debate on this aspect.
Anyone else? Well, I'm going back to the meta-analysis by Samuele Cortese and the Unified European Network, and the effect size of omega-3 supplementation on ADHD treatment is very, very low. It's 0.2 or something like that. So there's no evidence that it could help just a little bit, but on top of regular treatment. It's probably more effective for mood and for anxiety.
There is actually a question here in Spanish. You probably know how to read that better than I, Cesar.
Oh, where is it?
From Vivian.
Vivian. Oh, no, this is, I'm sorry, I have to leave. Thank you very much.
Okay. Another question. So, a question from Leslie. If a child is already medicated for ADHD, do you suggest to use Moxo with or without medication?
Both. Get a baseline and take a look on meds, see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. You guys have questions to each other as panelists? Things you want to address?
I actually do. I thought it was very interesting. I mean, all the talks to Dr. Berger. I found it very fascinating what you mentioned about the corticosteroids effect. And I mean, because in times of stress, and if it's a sustained stress, that's gonna go up. So, but then the other pro-inflammatory theory. So, you know, is it related to the stress itself, or you know, to the level of stress, or you think? I mean, is there? I don't know that literature. Is it related to the increase in steroids itself? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I think that the issue is a prolonged stress, meaning if you have a normal reaction of fight or flight, short period, not too prolonged and not too stressful, then the effect on attention is you know, normal and physiologic. The problem is with prolonged stress or significant stress like war zones, abuse, maltreatment of children, and then the HPA axis increased glucocorticoid for a longer period of time, and that caused damage. That's what happened in the ACE study, in adverse childhood experience and in toxic stress, and these children has higher levels of ADHD.
Right. So I was aware of some studies with where they stress it was done in animals, but they stress the animal when they're pregnant, and then they see the effect on the hippocampus and limbic areas on the pups, and they found that there was damage. So, but I wasn't aware of that. And then, as far as the treatment with, of the impact of diabetes, I have a lot of kids with that, and then they have ADHD, and then the ADHD is messing up the diabetes. And I always wonder if it's the forgetfulness, or is it the diabetes itself that is making the things worse, or what's your? But I don't have a lot of experience.
It's a good question. I'm not really sure. What I did in the study we've not yet published is I took the a tertiary care hospital large diabetes clinic, and I put all the children into assessment of ADHD. They came to the diabetes clinic, and a resident just caught them in the door and told them, "Let's do." Most of the parents didn't expect the results. And we found much higher proportion of children than we thought. And we offered these children a formal evaluation and maybe treatment. Now we're in the beginning, or not exactly, but still in the beginning of this process. And it seems that many of them needs better diabetes. I'll say it in the other way around. I think that some of them need ADHD treatment in order to improve the care of their diabetes. Mm-hmm. The parents were so busy with what happens with diabetes, which is really a severe issue, that they just ignored that. And they thought that everything wrong in their child life is because of the diabetes. And that's not true. So there's a lot of work.
Good point.
Published another study about it.
Did you see any difference in presentation of attention difficulties in chronic diseases between men and women?
I'm not really sure. I must say that I don't really know about it, but since I think that there are differences and that in post-pubertal, in adolescents and young adults, the hormonal issue is also significant. It will be interesting to test this. I'm not sure.
Professor Barish, related to your presentation, do you see differences in how Moxo displays attention symptoms in men versus men with suspected early dementia?
Well, yeah, actually, it's true that there's some differences between males and females, just like there are some differences between the group of patients with frontotemporal dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So there's mild differences usually. To be honest, females have a bit of a better kind of better profile with the attention tasks, but I need to go back and look the data. So how significant is that? But from the clinical experience, I have this tendency to think that the females have a better profile with attention in the Moxo.
Okay. I'm wondering, with regards to your presentation, Alison, and your experience with females, what sort of recommendations or advice would you give the teachers on what to look for and how to better manage their children with different types of ADHD in the classroom?
So I often ask teachers to rotate children around the room and see what happens when the kids, the inattentive kids tend to sneak off to the back of the classroom because they're not going to be noticed as much there. So rotating the kids, looking for the kids who they're always having to sort of tell them or encourage them to be in on-task behavior, or the child who's always looking around the room after everyone else has gotten started on the task and they're still trying to figure out what they're supposed to be doing. So those are the sorts of things that the kids that look like they're catching flies, that they look distracted, that the kids who are often nudging their seatmates and asking them what they're supposed to be doing. So again, it's very hard in the very big classrooms we have here. I mean, we have some classrooms, I think I don't know how you say tekken in English, but up to 41 kids in a class. It's really, really hard for these teachers to do their job. So, talking to kids as well. I think anytime that you talk to kids and you ask them, what they're experiencing, if the teacher has a good relationship with the child, they're likely to hear a lot more. But watching for the child who always seems to be one step behind is a pretty good way of catching the inattentive kids.
And probably the Zoom is not making the life easier from that perspective.
No, and the kids have been incredibly adept. The stories that I hear from kids about what they loop on their Zoom feeds so that the teacher thinks that they're there. Certainly the older kids, I mean, it's beyond my technical capacities, but the kids who are very inattentive and hyperactive and they can't sit in a classroom have figured out some very complex and sophisticated ways to have their teachers think they're actually present when they're not. And, I think that bears some kudos to them for managing their desired lack of presence in the classroom. But it's, again, interesting to talk to kids about what they do on Zoom.
I saw one joke that someone was attaching like the fan to the mouse, and then it appeared that the mouse was moving. It was just the fan that was going like that.
One of my own kids had like a loop of himself engaged in various behaviors, and it was very complex. I mean, he does computer programming, and
Wow.
and for all the classes he didn't want to be in, he would loop this thing. And I'm like, do the teachers not pay attention? They're like, no, they just want to see a face.
That's directly to the 8200 unit in the Israeli army.
Yeah,
that's a direct line to there.
Yeah,
I have a question a comment and a question to Alison, because I myself, I have been in different countries, like training in the US and then going back to Spain and then back to the US and also in England. And when you mentioned that like your own kids were looking very different when they were in England, in the UK versus in Israel, I had it, I was thinking about, if you, as far as the culture, if you have a very strict culture that you're supposed to be very, very still and you're not supposed to interrupt, you would guess that the rate of ADHD in that culture will be either high, low. Well, I think it could be higher, because then any little change that you can find is going to be thought to be a problem, as opposed to in a very lively, in a more open society, or like a situation or culture where, like in Spain, like everybody's moving their hands and the kids are jumping, they're getting up during dinner and they go to grab something and then they come back. That's pretty normal. So that would be very accepted. So the rating on the scales would be very low. But then you don't find that the rates in the UK are very low, and in the US.
So the UK is a great example. I see a lot of the kids they go very early to school in the UK. They're in school at 3.5, 4, and they learn stimulus control. They learn how to manage their behaviors in the classroom. It's also, I think, a fact that with many ADHD kids, when you think about emotional dysregulation, they do not want to dysregulate in front of their peers because there's a real high cost for that happening. And so they will hold it together in the classroom, and then they go back home and they fall apart. And so that's often a reason that we see these incredibly high rating scales from parents, because the parents get them at the end of the day after they've been working so hard to hold their stuff together, their dysregulation in the classroom. They do not want to come to the attention of their peers that way. They don't want to be the misbehaving child. What I see a lot in English kids, and I have a fairly decent sample of British kids who've moved to Israel, is that these kids who never had issues in England because they were in these very strict classrooms that were very, very well behaviorally maintained. And then they find themselves in an Israeli classroom. And the response I get from parents is, it's the education system in Israel. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. I mean, yes, there's an adjustment, but I think what happens is that these behaviors are just not seen as much because the teachers are managing. And we know that whenever we scaffold and we structure our environment, ADHD kids do better. So when we give recommendations for what to do, we're always going to give recommendations for higher scaffolding and higher structure because ADHD kids do better that way. So when they're in a culture where it's very structured, they tend to, I think, show less of the, I mean, I'm making gross generalizations here, but they tend to do better. And then when we sort of open the doors a little bit, the floodgates open and their behavior is much more apparent.
Yeah, well, I see what you're saying. I also heard a story that in ADHD in Japan, that the kid was labeled as ODD, oppositional, because he didn't bow when the teacher came. You know, so that it's like a level of expectation. It could be, it could go one way or another. I had the same experience with my kids when we moved to Spain. They were in a preschool in the UK, in the US, and they were like playing and doing all. And then they went to a Catholic school, and they told them, you have to write these, you know, these numbers. And they thought it was a suggestion. So they said, no, I don't want to do that. I prefer to play. So we were called immediately to the school. We said, no, this is not a suggestion. You actually have to do it.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, guys, thank you very much. This really concludes our symposium. It's been amazing discussions and amazing talks, and we will be uploading some of the discussions here to our website for other people to view later and for you guys to review as well. And I look forward to seeing you in the future, you and the rest of the people that joined us in our next symposium. Ronnie, start working on it. And have a good night and a nice weekend to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you and happy birthday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Zaltov.
Tada.